I'm going to talk about the developmental theorist that I find interesting. I have studied developmental theorists over the course of my education at St. Petersburg College, and there's many interesting theorists that have different ideas on how children develop, how their brains develop, and what sorts of behaviors they can output. The theorist that I find the most interesting and relatable to early childhood is a man named B.F. Skinner, and he came up with he's known as the father of operant conditioning, and he did a lot of experiments on animals to kind of reinforce what he thought about how children developed. So what he did was he put these rats inside what he called the Skinner box, and the rats had to learn that you had to go across this electric grid, but if you did and pushed a lever, then they were rewarded with food. So eventually the rats learned that all they had to do to get the food was just pull the lever. So that's an example of how their action was had positive reinforcement, or it was positively rewarded. So how did B.F. Skinner relate that to children? Well, he proposed that children can have good and bad behaviors reinforced by the positive rewards or the negative punishments. So children who did well on a test were rewarded with a sticker or something, monetary within the classroom. And this influenced the child to keep doing that same action again. So therefore, B.F. Skinner's theory on operant conditioning was valid. You make a child or encourage a child to do something, reward that action positively, and that entices the child to continue to do that. On the other hand, he said that if you reward an action with a negative reinforcement, then the child is less likely to do that action. So if a child is doing something like misbehaving and you make the child do something like be in timeout, then they're not going to do that action anymore. However, there is a fine line between negative reinforcement and punishment, because what happens when a child is punished is that they're not learning that their actions are misbehaving or is a form of misbehavior. They're learning that at that time they can't do that. So how does that relate to early childhood? Well, I think if you walk into I guess I shouldn't assume any, but I think without realizing it, teachers are using some aspect of Skinner's operant conditioning within their classroom. A lot of times with early childhood, good behavior is positively reinforced. Things like thank you so much for sharing the toys with your friends. I really like the way that you stood in line like that, or I love the way you use your manners when you ask that question. And then you also hear things like, we have to share in this classroom or you won't be able to play with that anymore. And I think to a child, they're thinking, well, I don't want to share because then I'll never get to see that toy again. And it's really interesting to me to think that the child's view of how they're supposed to act or how they're supposed to behave is different from what the teacher thinks that we're kind of conditioning them to do when they're in the classroom. So when you take Skinner's operant conditioning theory into perspective, you have to balance that fine line between continuous positive reinforcement to the point where they want to do it intrinsically for intrinsic reasons versus constantly punishing them for something that they are not aware that is a negative action. It's interesting that B.F. Skinner has come up so much in so many of my different courses as I progress through my degree here, because his theory on operant conditioning relates to developmental aspects across the board. It relates to how babies react and behave as they're infants. It relates to early elementary children and how they conduct themselves in the school and in the classroom and in public places. And then you can also kind of observe how it comes into play with adults in workplaces, co-workers, peers, things like that. So those are just some of the reasons why I think B.F. Skinner was a really, much ahead of his time theorist when he came up with this operant conditioning theory.